We listen for what the Spirit is saying to the church today. Would you join me as we pray for illumination? Ever-present God, you invite us to go with you to high places from where we can see who we have been and who you call us to be. Then you challenge us to go down to the plain and live in your love. May we hear your invitation to travel with you today. May we see a world open to us as a place to live generous lives of love. Amen.
The church year is about to move into a new season. Lent starts this week on Wednesday, and we'll be marking that with a special service in the evening. Traditionally, Lent is a time of preparation for Easter. Be that as it may, today we are still in the afterglow of Christmas. Over the last several weeks, we have been celebrating in different ways the manifestation of Jesus in the world, his baptism, calling disciples, first public appearance, first set of teaching, to name a few. Today, this set of firsts ends with a bang, with something called the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration is a story which describes a change in the appearance of Jesus. Jesus is transfigured. The Transfiguration takes place on a mountain and involves light and clouds. So, what better passage from the Hebrew Bible to accompany it than one that talks about God on a mountain? And in this case, our reading is one that tells a little bit of the story of Moses and Israel at Mount Sinai. Prior to this, the Israelites had fled slavery in Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and headed towards Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, they enter into a covenant with God, and as part of that covenant, receive instructions on how to live as God's people, what we call the law or the Torah, and at whose core is the Ten Commandments. The passages that lie around the one we are about to hear are really a sort of grab bag of stories and instructions. Our passage describes Moses going up the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments.
We read from Exodus chapter 24, verses 12 to 18. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction." So Moses set out with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. To the elders he had said, "Wait here for us until we come to you again, for Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute may go to them." Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the 7th day, he called to Moses out of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights.
That story is a bit opaque, I think. Did you notice that Moses set out with Joshua, and then Joshua drops out of sight, no mention of him? Or that Moses seems to go up the mountain twice? The mountain is covered with cloud, and the people below can see the top, the glory of the Lord, like a devouring fire. A few weeks ago, we talked about light and darkness and how sometimes light can be good, but sometimes it's threatening. Certainly in this case, light manifested as a devouring fire is not a comforting image. The darkness of the cloud that surrounds The light in the mountain is also a bit threatening. Our Gospel reading is from the Gospel according to St. Matthew. As I mentioned before, it's the story of the Transfiguration of Jesus, a story that's found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke. Like the story of the Exodus, it has a mountain with people going up it, and light and cloud and voices. However, in this case, the light and the cloud are not that threatening. They are, however, very confusing for the three disciples who were present.
Reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, verses 1 to 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With he I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." In sacred words of old, we have heard the Spirit speak anew.
Certain things roll around regularly each year, like birthdays or Adelaide Cup Day or Christmas or Easter, and the story of the Transfiguration in the lectionary. Now, I like birthdays. Often I get some really cool presents and have a nice meal, and if I'm lucky, the Queen has a birthday at the same time, so I get a holiday. Adelaide Cup Day comes with a holiday too, as do Easter and Christmas, and those last two have the added advantage of presents at Christmas and chocolate at Easter. But the Transfiguration, it's a bit of a disappointment. No chocolates, no holiday, just the same old story from Matthew or Mark or Luke. The Transfiguration and I go back a long way. When I started studying divinity at university, the Transfiguration was the first passage I wrote an exegesis paper on. I chose it because it was the shortest of the passages which had been set by the lecturer. But I found it rather odd. And I still find it rather odd. One day, quite out of the blue, Jesus invites only three, of his disciples to go off in private with him. It's a bit of a boys-only outing. He takes them to a nearby mountain and they climb it together. Then something really strange happens. Picture the scene. Jesus begins to glow. 2 figures appear beside him. Then a cloud like a giant UFO moves over Jesus, and a loud voice speaks. It's hardly surprising that the disciples collapse in fear. That is an odd story, and it's probably spawned thousands of copycat scenes in science fiction movies and stories through the ages. That's the story of the Transfiguration, since in it the appearance of Jesus is transformed. Although Matthew, Mark and Luke all relate the episode, there's nothing else quite like it in the story of the life of Jesus. For instance, in the Gospels, there are stories about miracles of healing. And although the miracles are all a little bit different, they all sound a bit the same. The same is true of the parables and the teaching of Jesus. But the Transfiguration is unique. It tells of a miraculous change in the appearance of Jesus on one and only one occasion. However, it's not your regular miracle. It's not like a healing miracle or a feeding of the 5,000 or the calming of the storm. No one is healed, no one is fed, no one's fears are taken away. In fact, come to think of it, in most miracle stories someone benefits from it, such as being healed. Yet in the story of the Transfiguration, no one benefits. No one gets a chocolate or a holiday. I wonder if we should call it a miracle at all. Matthew certainly does not. In his gospel, it's called a vision. As they come down from the mountain, Jesus tells the disciples not to tell anyone about this vision until after the resurrection. And what's more, they don't. Unlike some healing stories where people are healed and the onlookers can't keep quiet, no one talks about it, and that's odd. Calling it a vision makes more sense. A vision is something that does not really have to have happened. A vision, in one sense, occurs when something impacts a person's senses or a person's mind as if it were real. It feels actual, but of course it may not be. A vision is an act of imagination, sometimes almost involuntary, when our mind takes something that is and turns it into something else. A child who's been told stories of ghosts and bogeymen might see in the shadowy movement of a curtain a malevolent being. A politician believing that the clouds clear and the sun shines when he speaks has his own vision. Or, in a scene often played out in television or movies, a person deeply in love might look at their true love coming towards them and see the room blur, time slow down, and light surrounding the other person. A vision takes something that is and turns it into something else. In this case, the vision of the Transfiguration starts a week earlier, when Jesus asks the disciples who they thought he was. Peter answered that Jesus was the Christ. Jesus congratulated Peter and then began to teach them about the crucifixion and resurrection. Fast forward a week. The Transfiguration is a vision of Jesus as the Christ in glory. Moses and Elijah, perhaps symbols of law and prophets, or better, of the whole history and traditions of Israel, the saving story of Exodus, the covenant relationship, the continued presence of God, stand alongside Jesus and dialogue with him, as if to show how Jesus is firmly embedded in the story of Israel. And then a voice from the cloud proves the divine status of Jesus. In the vision, the disciples are seeing Jesus in a new light. They are unwrapping the statement, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," from 6 days before, and filling it with emotion, shifting the scene from dusty roads of Palestine with peasants in their shabby clothes to heaven. Outside, away from the mountain, these three are part of an evolving life of Jesus as he travels to Jerusalem. They are part of the business of each day, walking, eating, listening to Jesus teaching, worrying about Rome, and so on. On the mountain, their imagination runs away and shows them Christ in glory in heaven. Their imagination creates the scene of Jesus as the glorious Christ. But wait a moment. Something's wrong here. Something doesn't fit. How does Peter know that Jesus is chatting with Moses and Elijah? Do they come over and introduce themselves? Hi, I'm Moses. Pleased to meet you. And then there's this building of dwellings. Where will the material come from? Remember, they're high up on a mountain. Did Peter actually say, I'll just nip down to Bunnings and get the material for the dwellings? To which James replied, go to Bianco's instead, they'll deliver. And besides, it's a South Australian company. On a more serious note, the Transfiguration makes no difference to the disciples in the Gospel story. Peter, for instance, has seen this vision of Jesus in glory, yet he still denies Jesus, and all the disciples hide at the crucifixion. The Transfiguration does not seem to add to their faith. 6 days earlier, when Peter had said Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus responded by teaching them about what lay ahead, the crucifixion. Peter objected, God forbid it. And Jesus rebuked him. You are setting your mind on human things, not divine things, said Jesus. And so I wonder, and bear with me here, I wonder if the point of the Transfiguration is not to show us what Jesus in glory is like, but to show us what Jesus is not like, to show up the misconceptions of the disciples. What if the Transfiguration is a human thing pretending to be a divine thing, but not really a divine thing? Let me say some more. Peter, James and John are up on the mountain and see the vision of Jesus glowing brightly and so on. Then a cloud comes in and hides the three from view. A voice says, this is my beloved Son. And when the disciples look up, all they see is Jesus. The voice says about the same things at the baptism of Jesus, when Jesus appeared as a human being. So I wonder, maybe the voice is not referring to the vision of Jesus, the divine glowworm, besides Moses and Elijah, but Jesus, the bloke wearing normal clothes, standing there when the disciples look up again. This is my Son. This is my Son. Not the glorious glowworm, but the humble, dedicated person. So I wonder if that voice is not more like a bucket of water tossed over the disciples who are in some sort of fairy tale, faraway trance, imagining what Jesus is like. It pulls the disciples back to reality, just as Jesus did when he rebuked Peter 6 days earlier. Don't set your mind on human things. This is my Son, said the voice. Listen to his teaching, like the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount about love and care and suffering. Don't pay attention to thoughts of spotlights and fireworks and paparazzi in heaven. And in that case, perhaps the words of Jesus on the way down from the mountain are not a command to protect Jesus, but to protect the disciples. Don't tell anyone about your hallucinations, because you'll look like right proper nutters. Peter and James and John had fallen into a human trap. We look at people we admire through rose-coloured glasses. We want our leaders to look glorious. The Transfiguration is an expression of a human desire to glorify Jesus. Now, of course, Jesus is glorified because Jesus is God. But Jesus met us in the grungy reality of life. Jesus taught about how to live God's life in this grungy reality, not about glowing and singing in heaven. Jesus accompanies us as we travel through life, along the real roads of Adelaide, of this world, those real roads paved with bitumen, not golden bricks. And so the Transfiguration teaches us not to let ourselves run away with visions of glory, but to keep real. In the vision, the disciples, that's us, see Jesus standing over there like an LED light, with two dead blokes in a scene in which we don't fit, where we're just the observers. That's the vision. In the real world, Jesus stands with us in our lives and our activities. The teaching of Jesus is not about building dwellings on the mountaintop. If you read on in the book of Exodus, you'll find that chapters and chapters, in fact, are devoted to the building of the tabernacle, God's tent. Jesus doesn't talk much about it. He talks about doing things for others, about loving your neighbour. Over the last few weeks, we've been listening to readings from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. For Paul, Jesus is Lord, but that plays out in community relations, not building dwellings. The real vision behind the Transfiguration is not to see Jesus in glory, because that's easy. The real Transfiguration is looking at a real person, like someone passing you in the street, and seeing them as glorious and loved by God. That's the real Transfiguration. The real Transfiguration is to hear God's words, "This is my beloved Son," spoken about our neighbour as a member of God's family. At Scots, we've started an op shop. Although it's over 6 months old, it still feels like a relatively new venture to me, and something that once might not have been linked with the traditional ideas of social status and Scots. When I go up the stairs to my office on Tuesdays and Thursdays and look into the op shop, I see something more glorious than the second floor of David Jones, with racks of glowing clothes and divine beings fussing about them. Of course, that's not the reality. The lighting in Hamilton is not really up to par. The staff up there are brilliant. Anne is a splendid manager and Sarah a great assistant, but they don't glow as they walk around. The reality is that Anne is soon to leave Adelaide and will be a bit short on volunteers for a few weeks. Yet the true glory of God is peeking through the shop. That Wednesday on the forecourt was great fun when so many of you volunteered. And locals are pitching in various ways. Just last week someone came by and gave us 2 boxes of new shopping bags, not plastic ones but the material ones, to pack our sales in. And of course our neighbours in this next door gave us some fine high fashion shoes before that. So community is growing already. Business is growing. More of the diverse community of the city is dropping by. That's where we see the glory of God in the growth of the community. At the end of the story of the Transfiguration, the group of 3 disciples and Jesus come down from the mountain. If the challenge of the Transfiguration is to see the divine in the day-to-day around us without dazzling white clothes or faces shining like the sun, then we can't do that isolated on the top of a mountain. We need to be embedded in life. We need a community to teach what Transfiguration means and to help us learn to see the glory as we live through and reflect on 1,000 day-to-day experiences. And we need to remember that God is not over there shining like the sun and chatting with 2 dead holy men, but right beside us, touching us, offering us a hand up when we need it, and living life with us. Amen.